All right, today's topic is World War One. The goal for today is to be able to identify what exactly caused the Great War. So, World War One is called many different things. It goes by the war to end all wars, the Great War, and today we know it as World War One. This is because at the time it was seen as the biggest war that had ever happened, so the Great War. It was also so devastating that people thought there's no way we could possibly have war again after something like this, so they refer to it as the war to end all wars. And of course, today we know it as World War One because really it was just the precursor to World War Two. So let's get into it. Let's see what caused the Great War to kick off. As you know from this class, nothing just happens. Everything is a consequence of something that came before it. So to understand World War One's causes, we need to understand how it is rooted in history. So the last major wars in Europe were the Napoleonic Wars, and these ended up costing between 2.5 and 3.5 million lives of soldiers, plus an additional 3 million lives of civilians, non-combatants, right? However, only a few years before the Napoleonic Wars, there were the Wars of Revolutionary France's expansion, right? Going back about 30 years before that, there was the Seven Years' War, where the major powers of Europe were going to war with each other in Europe and around the world. Only a few years before that, you'll remember in between 1701 and 1714, we had the War of Spanish Succession. Then, of course, a few decades before that, you had the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648. So, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, it's kind of understandable that they're trying to find a way to make sure that this doesn't happen again. They want to preserve the peace, create a balance of power between these different empires in a way that no one empire is going to be able to overpower all the others to make it less likely another massive war is going to break out, right? The Congress of Vienna is actually a pretty successful endeavor, and it does keep the peace in Europe for longer than usual. But about 70 years after the Congress of Vienna, the scramble for Africa kicks off, and there's a fear among the European powers that they're going to wind up having wars in Europe over who gets to control what parts of Africa. So they decide to meet in 1884 in the city of Berlin to decide how they're going to carve Africa up. This is known as the Berlin Conference, and literally they carve Africa up like a cake. That's what they're showing here in this cartoon, carving it into different pieces. And this map of Africa kind of shows what they were going about doing. The green sections are awarded to France, the darker green go to Portugal. Belgium gets this giant section called the Congo. That is going to be a very important thing to talk about in class. It's not good. Bad things, very bad things happen there. The British get control of the orange areas, Germans the small purple areas. The problem is when they cut this map up and divided it up amongst themselves, they had no idea what they were doing. They didn't know what empires were there, what cultures were there, and they wound up creating a lot of problems by putting different cultures who hated each other into the same territory and taking a single culture and splitting it into different territories. And this is going to set the stage for some serious consequences and bloodshed in the post-World War II area as these areas decolonize and try to create modern nation states out of the remnants of their colonialism. In the process of taking over all these areas of Africa, the Europeans were really relied on their advantages from the industrial and scientific revolutions. They had been inventing brand new types of warfare and guns, like the automatic machine gun is now a thing and it's being mass produced in factories, and this makes victory a lot easier for Europeans against other cultures who did not have the machine gun. This, of course, gets Europeans to have a big head about themselves, look how tough we are, look how great we are, these empires are gathering more weapons, and whenever you give people who love the military new weapons, they kind of want to test them out and use them to show how tough they are. This is going to set the stage for World War One. So that's all a review. That sets the stage for World War One. But what are the contributing factors that led to this thing actually exploding? Historians like to use the acronym MANIA to understand that. So we're going to go through each one of these points one by one. So militarism is simply the glorification of war and the belief that it's the only way to solve problems and really prove you're a man. So there's a lot of masculinity tied up in this whole militarism. The idea that war is this glorious thing that you can go fight, prove how tough you are, how great you are, and it's really the only way to solve problems because other people aren't going to respect you unless you can smack them down in war. Now, the scramble of Africa made people think that war was this glorious and quick thing that you go, you do, you fight, and you come back, and everyone celebrates. You prove how big of a man you are. But the glorification of war in Africa is nothing like the reality of war in Africa. After all, Europeans came there with modern machine guns, right? The first machine guns, this industrialized warfare, whereas many of these African cultures, best case scenario, they had single bolt action rifles or they had spears and traditional shields. And when you've got a massive army like this with traditional weapons up against a couple people with machine guns, this is not going to last very long. It's also not going to be very glorious. It's not fair at all. And so there was this misconception in Europeans' minds of war. What war was supposed to be like, this glorified war of manlyhood, and the reality of war, which is a guy sitting down with a gun and just mowing down hundreds of people. There's nothing glorious or glamorous like about any of that. And up until the invention of the machine gun, warfare really hadn't changed very much for the last couple hundred years, right? This is what people thought of as warfare. You got a bunch of people in brightly colored uniforms lining up against each other, taking shots at each other, and then ramming at each other with their rifles that have bayonets, large knives attached to the end of it. And it could be like one courageous guy could take on a bunch of people. And really it was, kind of these two equal armies. And this is how people thought of warfare. But again, that's not the reality of warfare anymore. The machine gun, the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution really did change this forever. And governments knew this, right? Even though the popular idea of war was something different, and governments thought playing war was still a way to be manly and show how tough your country is, they knew war was changing, right? They had been investing a lot of time and money into scientific advancements in weapons, right? Planes get invented and they figure out very quickly how to attach bombs to them. Cars get invented and they very soon learn how to armor them and attach artillery to it. You got the machine gun, even with you get chemical warfare coming about this time, right? So these are new ways to kill people on a massive scale. This is not a bunch of people with rifles shooting at each other and then running at each other and showing how tough they are and how brave they are. No amount of braveness is going to help you beat a machine gun or a tank or gas weapons. Yet the armies were still training their soldiers to run at the enemy en masse and try to shoot them with their rifles and stab them with their bayonets, right? This was the standard way of fighting, and this is how they trained their armies. The problem is they had no real tactics for how to get past trenches that are guarded by machine guns. You just can't do it. So your guys are going to get mowed down, and this is how a lot of people die. Their bodies are thrown at a wall of bullets that are being launched out of the machine guns as they're trying to capture the other side's trenches. They're also creating alliances with each other, right? Teaming up against each other, sometimes knowingly, sometimes through intermarriages, right? We saw this with the Habsburg, creating this interrelated weave of networks of alliances based on marriage. Sometimes they're well known, sometimes they're secret. It was really hard to know sometimes who exactly was on whose side, and this meant that so what you thought was a small skirmish somewhere would quickly escalate, bringing in all the other countries of Europe and enveloping the world in war once again. And the way it shook out when the war started, you wound up really getting two sides. You had the Allied powers, the green ones, Russia, Romania, Serbia, Greece, Italy, France, Great Britain, and Portugal. And then you had the Central powers, which was Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire coming in. And this is the Ottomans are kind of at the end of their lifespan here. They're just a strong wind could knock these guys over, but they're this ancient power, right? These are the guys who knocked out the Roman Empire. They're the ones who knocked out what we call the Byzantine Empire. So they jump in thinking this is going to be their chance to kind of grab some land and get some glory back. Then comes the N in mania, nationalism. This is the belief that people who share a common nation deserve their own state, right? Remember, nations are a group of people who share a common history, culture, language, things like that. And this idea that not only does a nation deserve its own government independent from other nations, but it's also this idea that your nation is better than everyone else's, and that if another nation gets stronger, then that's going to weaken you. So this is the British saying, the British nation is the best nation in the world. The Germans going, no, the German nation is the best nation in the world. Here you see propaganda poster from Britain. This is your flag. It stands for liberty. Fight for it. Join the Royal Army, right? This idea of you are the flag is you. It's a symbol of you, your family, your culture, everything you stand for. And then you have this other British piece of propaganda over here: destroy this mad brute. And it's a baboon-like kind of creature here. He's wearing a German-style military helmet. He's supposed to be a stand-in for the Germans, right? They're not even human, this nation of animals, of beasts. And who are they carrying off? Of course, they're carrying off our women. This all is an allusion to the eugenic stuff that we were talking about in a previous lesson, where, this other nation is trying to dilute our nation's greatness with their inferior traits, right? It's just eugenics nonsense. All right, let's get to the I in mania: imperialism. Imperialism is when one country is trying to control other countries to take their resources away from them in order to enrich themselves, right? Europe has been doing this for centuries at this point. And because of this, Europe has expanded its control to a lot of different places all over the globe, making this a global war. And once war breaks out in Europe, they're going to pull in people and resources from all over the globe. To show how massive this is, right? Here's just two empires. On the left here, you've got the British Empire, everything in red. On the right here, you have pink. Everything in pink is the French Empire, right? That's a pretty sizable amount of the world's population and landmass just between two of these empires that'll be part of this war. Throw in the empires of Germany and Russia here, and now again, you can see how big this is, right? This is just four countries in Europe that control, added up, looks to be maybe about half the world's landmass. This is why we call it a world war, and so people and resources from all these different places will soon flood into Europe for this combat. Because of imperialism, this is what the world map looks like during World War One. So everything in blue here is a country that's a member of the Allied powers. The orange are countries that are part of the Central powers, and a lot of this is simply because of colonialism. Now you might be wondering, why is Brazil over here in this war, the one big part of South America that's being pulled in? That's because of their connection to Portugal, which, you remember has a lot to do from the Napoleonic Wars, and from even far before that, the Treaty of Tordesillas during the Age of Exploration. So the Mani part of this are the contributing factors, right? The MANI. You got militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, right? These are all things that kind of contribute to create basically a bunch of dry tinder laying around Europe that a spark could just ignite and set off, right? Any number of things could happen that could light this fire, but what's the thing that actually wound up lighting the fire that destroyed and blew up Europe? It is the final AN mania: assassination. It was a political murder of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Now, this guy, with his glorious mustache, doesn't seem so important, but his murder is what triggers this war. Franz Ferdinand here is the heir to the Austrian Empire's throne, which means he is going to be the next Austrian emperor. Now, Franz Ferdinand here is wait for it, Habsburg. Yes, he's related to the Habsburgs. And it's his murder that sets off World War One. So Franz Ferdinand here is the heir to the Austrian throne, and he's kind of on a tour of his empire so he can get to meet his people and know his people that he's going to be in charge of once the current emperor dies and he takes over. So he is down here in this region that is kind of referred to as Serbian. There's a lot of different nationalities in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, right? The red areas are people who identify as German. The green areas are people who identify as Hungarian. Then you got a whole nother group over here, right? Down here, you've got Serbians, right? And they think that they deserve their own independent country that is not part of an Austrian-Hungarian Empire. So while the Archduke Franz Ferdinand is touring this area, the short version is that a Serbian here pulls out a gun on the tour route and shoots and kills the Archduke, and this is what sets off World War One. Now, there's a longer version of the story we'll talk about in class. Okay, but fine, it's a Serbian kills an Austrian. How's that start a global conflict? Well, here's the thing. Austria here is allies with Germany, all right? So that brings in all that mess. But the problem is the Serbians, they have their own secret alliance with the Russians over here. So, but who are the Russians allied with? They're allies with the French. So this brings the French and the Russian Empire into this conflict, as well as the German Empire into a conflict that happened to just be about the Austrians and the Serbians. Because Germany is feeling threatened. They got the Russians over on one side in their east, and they got the French on the other side in their west. And so they've been planning for this war. They've been thinking it's coming. Because remember, Europeans were glorifying war. That's militarism at its core. And so they've been planning for this. They knew another war was coming, and the Germans had this grand plan. They were going to march straight through Belgium and use that to attack France, because their border with France was pretty well defended. And everyone had a treaty that said, we're going to respect the neutrality of Belgium. Germany said, yeah, we're going to respect the neutrality, by not attacking them as long as they don't attack us when our armies march through Belgium to get to France. Well, this is the problem because Belgium's closest ally is the United Kingdom over here, and that's what brings the British Empire into this fight. Then, of course, the United States dragged into this, and it has to do with the sinking of a cruise ship called Lusitania. It had some American citizens on it. It was off the coast of Europe, and the Germans sank it. The Americans said it was just a civilian ship. This is barbarity. How could the Germans do this? The Germans said, yeah, no, you had weapons on there that you were selling to our enemies, and so it made it fair game. And it turned out, yeah, we had weapons on it. But anyways, so the death of these civilians was used to justify America entering this war on the side of Great Britain. That leads us to the final key question here is why was the Great War such a devastating event? Well, over 20 million civilians died, another 20 million were injured, and the majority of the people who died in this war were actually Russian. The Russians suffered the highest casualties of any empire in this war. This is going to have serious consequences because, like, Russia keeps getting attacked, right? World War I, they get invaded. The Napoleonic Wars, they get invaded. They have this history of being invaded. Heck, the Mongols invaded them. So the Russians kind of have this chip on the shoulder. And then when it happens again in World War II, it kind of something snaps where they just decide never again will they be allowed to allow themselves to be put into a place where they can be invaded and lose so many of their countrymen's lives. It's a reasonable kind of position to come to after you understand the history of World War I, World War II, the Napoleonic Wars, and well, just the history of Russia in general. But that's a story for what happens after World War II, which we're not getting to in this lesson. Now, it's very devastating because the main method of fighting this war, as we referenced earlier, was trench warfare. And these are these long ditches that soldiers lived, traveled, and fought in. Now, so many trenches were dug that actually, if you measured every single trench, the length of every trench that was dug for World War I, you could actually have a line dug from New York City to Los Angeles. That's east to west coast of the United States and back 6 times. That's how long and how many trenches are dug for this war. They were filthy, they were filled with mud, rats were all around because they're just scavenging for food. In some areas, dead bodies are staying laying around. Outside the trenches, there's that no man's land between your trenches and the other side's trenches. Those are filling up with bodies. And really, the only time you left these trenches was to climb out into no man's land, to run across through that, through all the mortars, the mines, the bombs being dropped by the planes, through the barbed wire, through all the machine gun fire, through the rifle firing of the other side soldiers, down into their trenches to try to kill them, right? That's kind of the only time you got to leave these horrible places. Now, this war was so devastating, so terrible, and what people saw was nothing like anything ever seen before, that we created this new term for what it did to people's brains. It's called shell shock. And essentially, it kind of broke people's minds, the type of horror that they experienced, because it was beyond anything anyone could ever have imagined. It was just that terrible. Right? You can see it in the eyes of soldiers, that 1,000-mile stare where they can't tell what's going on. They're not really there anymore. Like they've disassociated because that's the only way they can process the absolute horror and terror that they've seen, right? Here you might want to laugh at this picture, but again, this person is experiencing this absolute horror that freezes their brain, freezes their face, and they're unable to operate in any way. There's even cases of soldiers who come back, and this man, for example, he loses his brain's ability to control his body, just severs because he's just so traumatized by his experience in war. This is literally, today we're so desensitized to violence, but back then, there weren't really movies, there weren't video games, they didn't see any of this violence on the grand scale that we see in movies today. And they saw this type of violence, real violence, on a scale never before imagined, in real life, in person, seeing their friends die. It literally broke them in a way that I don't think you or I could truly fully understand. All right, we're going to dig more into World War I when we get to class, but for now, just to rewrite today's goal, those 3 facts that you learned that help show you met that goal, and then one question you still have from the lesson or anything connected to it. All right, see you soon.